Hello, I'm George Hayward, author of The Party Dolls. It's a true tragic story of a failed 1969 escape attempt by two POWs from a North Vietnamese prison camp. One of those men, Ed Atterberry, died in the attempt, and very little was known about him. His cellmates didn't know him well. He was a reconnaissance pilot, not a fighter pilot like them, and he tended to keep to himself. So a few months ago, I was really surprised when I heard from a man named Bruce Edwards, who was also a retired reconnaissance pilot who had served with Ed Atterbury in Vietnam and knew him, was stationed with him on the day he was shot down. Bruce and I had a couple conversations over the course of a few months where he filled me in on some details about Ed that I didn't know, gave us some background, really helped me understand a man I'd written a book about. What you're about to watch is some excerpts from our conversations. I hope you enjoy it.
Okay, let me give you a little background on how Ed got there. Ed and I went over, 1967, the big push started on manning the combat equipped airplanes, for North Vietnam in, say, early 60s, not too long after Tonkin. And so they started putting people into the slots over there, and the Air Force came up with the idea that the risks going north, getting counted going into North Vietnam, were great enough that they, just like World War II when it was a 25 mission limit, and in Vietnam they made it a 100 mission limit. The exposure time wasn't near as long as the guys in the 8th Air Force, with the B-17s and all that, were hours being shot at. A sortie factor for us flying out of Thailand was usually no more than about an hour and a half from takeoff to landing. You're going fast, you get it done, you turn it out, and you come home. Same with the fighter guys. Fighter guys, the first ones they went to fill the slots were the squadrons that were combat ready, and the guys had experience like that. They started and those are guys that had more experience. They'd been in the equipment for a period of time, and lots of practice. If you were based in Europe, you'd go down to North Africa where the sun was shining all the time, and you'd spend a lot of time in the bombing range. They got pretty good at what they did. Same in our business in reconnaissance. We do the same. I was over at Ramstein, and we also go down there and got a lot of work. But the thing is, the Air Force, just like I think all the American military, when the war is over, you go to sleep for a while, whatever it is. And then when it's time to do something again, you fall back on your last experiences. Well, the experience in reconnaissance at the time I got into it was based pretty much on tactics from World War II, when they were flying, P-51s, they called them F-6s, I think. They had cameras instead of guns. So, well, they also had guns, but their mission was to get tactical reconnaissance, to take pictures, before a strike, potential targets, all this kind of stuff, bomb damage assessment. So it's everything they wanted pictures for. There were no satellites, there were no YouTubes, there were no, so everything we knew about what things looked like were snapped by an airplane, a tactical reconnaissance airplane. When I got into it, I was sitting on basically a World War III war plan. And with the guys who drew up the plans, the experience they knew, they might not have actually been tactical reconnaissance pilots, but the information they had was based on their experiences from the past. And so our tactics were based on the tactics from World War II. It was low level, 500 feet, 360 knots, which is like a balloon goes about that fast, and zeroing in the target, learning to get. You took 5 photographs, and ideally your target would be in the 3rd photograph centered if everything was working out right and all. And you'd get a good briefing from Intel on what you were looking for. And then another thing that was based on World War II, we had one of our big challenges to do the job right, and it made us very competitive with each other, were things like EEI, essential elements of information. And you'd go out and on our daily practices and all, we'd go out on a low level, and say we would be going after a towers, radio towers or something like that. So when we landed, we would simulate that our sensors didn't work, our cameras malfunctioned or something, and you sit down with Intel, and you had to give them a description of the tower. You tell them how high it was, what kind of antennas, so you had to be able to identify the HF from the microwave, from the different kinds of antennas that would be on top. You come back and you'd get them a verbal description that was about as good as a photograph. Same thing as on a dam. You'd go in and how many sluices it had, how many gates it had, just all the things of what the height of it was. On a bridge, what it was made out of. You give a description of the bridge, the approaches to the bridge, all that. And train, count the cars, what kind of cars they were, and all. So it was really, you trained your mind to focus to get a visual mental snapshot of a target. And then as soon as you turn, you get on track for your next target or something like that. As soon as you were stable, you reach out on your clipboard and you jot these quick notes down about the target you had just passed to refresh your memory when you landed. And you'd have maybe 3 targets, maybe 6 targets, depending. Sometimes you do strips. In other words, there would be a road or a railroad, and you'd turn on the camera and strip it down the whole way, and all to see the crossings and all. So that was a pretty important thing to us, being able to do that kind of work. It was very challenging. The cardinal rule in reconnaissance is to know every second where you are, and and when you're going to be the next place. So it was a matter of map drawing and all. We didn't have inertial navigation. We didn't have satellites. We didn't have anything. So it was a map on your lap, and you controlled, your position. Very important was your ground speed. You'd maintain that. You'd take into account before you went, how the wind was going to affect you, what the radius of your turn was, so you'd roll out exactly on the line to your next target, all that. Well, that was great in World War II, and it was really handy, and it proved who the good pilots were when you compared your abilities, to the next guy.
But, Bruce explained to me, there was a huge difference between reconnaissance, or recce, in World War II and recce in Vietnam. The concept of alone, unarmed, and unafraid.
Well, guys in reconnaissance at that time, when they had a gun, they'd go out and they'd get the target on film, and they'd head home, and maybe they'd see a Messerschmitt. Well, what's their priority? Get the Messerschmitt. And so sometimes the film didn't make it back, and that would frustrate the people who needed the film. So they came up with a concept of alone, unarmed, and unafraid. In other words, they took your ability to defend yourself away from you, so all you could do is maneuver your way to safety. And they wanted you to think about nothing but getting home with the film. So consequently, from then on, we weren't fighter pilots anymore. We were pure tactical reconnaissance pilots. No guns, no missiles, no rockets, no bombs, no nothing. So that's what, that was the focus right there. And the alone, unarmed, and unafraid thing was something, they said to make you feel better about it. And but the guys who were in recce at that time were very good at what we did.
There were other factors affecting recce pilots at the time: an intense ops tempo and, typical of the Vietnam War, politics.
Now we're in a completely different war. We had fought against a completely different kind of enemy with different objectives, and we're trying to adapt. So the real recce guys, the guys that have been doing this kind of stuff I told you about for years and gotten real good at it, all of a sudden we go over there and all that goes out the window, and they say, okay, here's your targets, and President Johnson doesn't like these pictures that he's getting when you're going low and fast, and they get a little bit blurry and all like that, and he wants something to put on the board and have explained to him all this around. So they made us fly higher. So instead of 500 feet, we were up around anywhere from 11, 13, 15,000 feet or something like that to get a lot of coverage of the camera, hoping the resolution was good enough to give them what they needed. Unfortunately, flying at those levels put us in range of every kind of defensive that the North Vietnamese and their friends could put up against us. We were vulnerable to just about everything. So consequently, and then of course you can't jink when you're in a reconnaissance airplane because you got the cameras rolling and you ruin the images. So you have to fly straight and level with your head in a viewfinder or whatever, taking the pictures. So your only defense is speed. So we like to go very fast. Now, the F4, which we converted to from the 101, I had converted in 66, I guess. We started getting them in Germany from the 101. So by 67, I had about a year's worth of experience in the F4, but with the same tactics and things, and went over there. And we had to relearn flying in that environment from the way we did. And that included Atterberry and all the guys, with the backgrounds and Recce. And so we had to relearn, try to stay alive by going fast, try to keep your nerve up so you didn't ruin your film and all like that with too many evasive maneuvers, only when necessary. So now but thing was they had a 100 counter limit. In other words, if you broke the border into North Vietnam, not with Texas, just any place in North Vietnam, you got a counter. When you got to 100 counters, you could go home. So the guys went over, they were getting assigned over there. At first, there's 10 guys over TDY orders, and then they sent them over on PCS orders to say who wouldn't have to pay them per diem or like that,
Right.
And, but instead of staying there for a year like the Army did and stuff like that, when you got 100 over North Vietnam and went flying out of Udon, flying out of Thailand, everything was over North Vietnam. So guys started picking up. After 4 months, they'd have 100 counters. They had 20, flying almost every day, and every one of them was breaking the border. And so guys are going to have that 4 months, plus a few shoot downs and things like that. The attrition rate went up pretty high. So they came up with orders. They started putting guys in the FTDs, the field training detachments, down at Bergstrom and all, to teach them how to fly the reconnaissance airplane, because they didn't have enough reconnaissance pilots left, because they were all burning out, they were all going home and all. And so they started taking guys out of SAC and out of, different commands, HC and all like that, and putting them in a Recce airplane and trying to teach them in, I don't know what it was, 6 weeks or something like that, how to fly the airplane, how to be a Recce pilot, which is impossible. But even the FTDs, until they got really geared up, couldn't produce guys fast enough to go over and keep the slots full. Guys kept going home faster than they were being replaced. So they set up some orders, and they tried. It wasn't a pleasant word, though, but they were called attrition pilot orders. So they went to each of the Recce bases, and they asked each of them to provide 2 qualified crews to go over as attrition pilots to fill the gap. Only 90-day orders. And they wanted volunteers. I was a bachelor. I volunteered to go over. I did over there before in a different kind of airplane and all like that. But I had, I was young and dumb and it was a good deal. So they came up with 2 crews from each of the bases. Well, Ed Atterberry, and I believe, based on what you said in your book about the time of this guy Laurie Langiel, must have been attrition crews from Mountain Home. And a guy named Bill McCaffrey and I were the 2 attrition crews who volunteered from Ramstein, and a couple from Alconbury. So I guess that, I don't know, it gave us maybe 14, 16 crews or something like that, that went over to, and we were on 90-day orders, is all. It's 90-day TDY. They figured that would be enough time. And we were all supposed to go to Saigon, down to Tan Son Nhut, to the 16th TRS. And so when we showed up, at first they sent us to the Philippines for some quick jungle survival training, and then they had a rainstorm that caused a landslide that killed a couple guys, and so they shut down the survival thing, so they kind of pencil whipped our survival training. And we went over to Tan Son Nhut, and the day I got there, this fella, Colonel Hines, from Udorn, came down and met us and sat us down and gave us a gung-ho lecture. He said, gentlemen, said the real war is being fought, just real gung-ho guy. And he needed 4 crews up there, and because they were losing them a little quicker than they thought, up in Udorn. And in Udorn, everything was over the north. Ton Sanut, you might fly over the north once every 10, 14 missions or something like that. Mostly it was over the south at night with photo flash fire because the threats were not very high. Over the north, the threats were really high, so very little bit of night flying, a lot of fast stuff, a lot of getting shot at and all like that. So he needed some crews.
In our next conversation 2 months later, Bruce had done some research and reached out to some of his Recce friends.
By reading that email, you can see that Wittenberger, he knew Ed Atterberry as an instructor at Mountain Home. So that gives you a little bit of background on Atterberry, what he was doing there. He had gone, I believe, from Alconbury, where a bunch of guys knew him, and that's what I thought. I thought he came over from Alconbury, to tell you the truth. And it wasn't until we started looking at this I realized he came out of Mountain Home. But I think they had sent him to Mountain Home as an FTD instructor to, get these guys from SAC and so on checked out in the RF4. Somebody with more experience. And then while he was there, this 90-day TDY thing came up, and he probably did volunteer for it, and went over there and would have gone back because his PCS base by that time was Mountain Home, and would have gone back after that.
And that's how Ed Atterberry went to Vietnam.
Then Ed Atterberry and Tom Parrott they volunteered. And I think this Lignell must have been because it looked like he got there the same time we did, around June '67, something like that. So he was probably in the same attrition group that Ed and I were in. And he stayed in the 16th down at Ton Sanut. So he, I'm not sure he was shot down. He's probably shot down at attack 1 or 2 or something like that, but I think he was in the same group. And then of the 4 of us that went up there, 8 guys, and 3 of them didn't come home, and Ed and Tom Parrott were 2 of them. When they got shot down. Right. I think he must have had, and they let us. It was 90 days, but we weren't there the entire 90 days. And when we hit 50 counters, they sent us home.
When these Recce pilots went up on missions, the experienced pilots like Atterberry and Edwards were matched with less experienced pilots in 2-ship formations. In the next passage, Bruce explains how Atterberry was likely shot down based on sequential images of his aircraft being hit by a SAM, courtesy of his wingman, the other ship in the formation. There's a point in this where Bruce says southeast of Saigon. He'd later clarify he meant to say Hanoi.
When Ed got shot down, that's what he was doing. He was on the wing of Bill Williams. Bill Williams was one of the FTD guys. I don't know what he had flown previously. I didn't know him that well. And Ed was on his wing. And when they, just because it was Bill Williams' first lead. Bill Williams had flown wing, had flown number 2, because we flew everything 2-ship. And I'll tell you more about the reason for that. Because before that, we'd flown single ship. In the old kind of Recce, it'd be 1 airplane, lone and alarmed and just, but in that environment in North Vietnam, we flew 2-ship because we were carrying something called the APQ 160 or something like that. It was a pod under the wing that would help us blank out the Fansong radar scope about 2 degrees of it, enough so that they couldn't achieve a good firing solution to shoot us down. And if you maintain good Recce formation and this thing was working, it increased your survivability chances by a lot against the SAM. And so Ed was on Williams' wing, and they got down to this area just southeast of Saigon. And when you look at those pictures like you have there, if you look down on the ground, you'll see what we call the bra. It looks like a brazier of the Red River down southeast of Saigon. And you can see that in the background, so that enabled to spot exactly where they went down.
Oh, wow.
And the fact is that they have those good pictures of Ed indicates that something went wrong. Because if you're flying pod formation so that you could effectively blank out the scope, you was like 1,500 feet laterally off the wing, 500 feet in elevation difference, higher or lower than lead, and 500 feet either forward, which never, or aft of lead. And so that angle right there would give you maximum benefit from your jamming ability against the stance-on radars. Well, the fact that Ed is centered in that photograph shows you that he wasn't in the correct position. And the reason he wasn't in the correct position, here are these guys, you're flying about Mach 1.2, and lead Williams started a bit of a left turn, might not have announced it, but just, wanted to do a bit of a left turn to make an adjustment. And Ed couldn't fall back to maintain his position fast enough because they're flying at the same speed. So if you're turning into a guy, that put Ed right directly, lateral to Williams, and therefore we got good pictures of him. If he was in the correct position, he wouldn't have shown up in the panoramic camera. So, and that's probably contributed to why the SAM got him, because now the SAM could see him.
In our second conversation, Bruce offered another explanation for the shoot-down. Word of my book was spreading through the recce community, and Bruce's former colleagues were reaching out to him.
When I talked to the guy who called me, who was Wizzo in that airplane, right, they said, as he recalls it, they took off and Ed Atterberry's ECM pod was not working. And rather than abort the mission, they went without it. So, that's like asking for it. If that's indeed true, that also explains why the missile got him, wasn't jammed.
Yeah,
so
totally.
Yeah.
Right.
But that was his recollection. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure one of those two has to be the correct explanation of why the missile got him.
Bruce remembers the day at Udorn when Atterberry was shot down. He was able to view the shoot-down images soon thereafter, freshly developed.
It was a high-altitude panoramic camera, so he doesn't look real big. He's 1,500 feet out there, but he looks real tiny in the frame. And but the photograph that came after the last one, that's generally published, that you can get online or like that, showed nothing left but a fireball behind him, supersonic fireball, and the airplane broke it off behind the cockpit, and the way they turned the picture, when he got out, the PI got out his magnifying glass, you could see two helmets still in the cockpit.
Oh, wow.
And then after that, you couldn't see anything. So we figured they were dead. We figured, well, they didn't get out. And here this thing is tumbling supersonic. You can imagine the G-forces on these guys and the heat, from the fire. But fortunately, I guess the fire stayed back in the fuel tanks area and all like that. And when the airplane broke apart, the canopy area got free. So, and when the G-forces came off enough for them to be able to initiate their ejection, they both got out of the airplane. And I don't know how. Now, Ed Atterberry, when he landed, and the other guy you talked about that went down with him he was a fighter, I think a 105 pilot, went down the same day about the same time. So they picked them all up, and they didn't have Tom Parrott, the navigator's photo. They had just his ID card photo that what we were told was a New China news agency published the next day. Yeah. But that's how we found out that Ed was still alive, and we assumed, even though it was just a passport photo of Tom, that we hoped that meant he was alive too. And the reason they didn't have a regular photo of him is because he was unconscious, I think, for about 5 days after he hit the ground. And but they did take his ID card picture. They took a picture of that, and then they took a picture of Ed and the fighter pilot, and they published those. And that gave us, we said, well, at least Ed is alive, and we hope that means Tom's alive too. So that's how we found that they were down.
That's a powerful memory and paints some vivid imagery. Bruce also had some thoughts about John Dramisi. He didn't know Dramisi, but they had some things in common. They were both New Jersey boys who wrestled in school, and that gave him some interesting insights into Dramisi's possible motivations and behaviors.
Well, I have a couple thoughts that may or may not be valid, but about John Dramisi. I didn't know him. I lived in New Jersey for years and years, and he was a Jersey boy, and
Yeah.
and I did a little wrestling in school, and he was big time into wrestling,
Oh wow.
and matter of fact, it wasn't covered very much, and I tried to find out a little bit more about his record, and I couldn't. I'm sure it's out there, but he was on the Rutgers wrestling team, which is a ranked team, so he must have been pretty good at it.
Right.
And there's something about wrestlers that made the way John Dramisi acts make sense to me. In other words, you talked about him. Do you mind if I just get into this a little bit?
Yeah, no, please.
Exactly.
Yeah. Excellent.
You talked about his attitude and the way it was and the way it was perceived and all of that, and you wondered a little bit about his motivations and all. And I think I've known some very intense, and looking at John almost makes me think this, very intense guys, and to excel in wrestling, by and large, your biggest foe or your opponent is yourself, because it's you're going full out. When I wrestled, it was like 3-3-3, 3-minute period. So it probably was when he was. That by the time if you didn't get a pin and you had got you were really beat. So you were being tested all the time, 1-on-1. And I think his challenge was to prove himself to himself. And that's probably the way he approached a lot of things. Because I saw guys with that kind of a background generally. It doesn't have to be a wrestler, but it kind of fits with that attitude. That's very intense, demanding a lot of themselves, and it comes across as demanding a lot of the people around him too. High standards and all like that. Physical standards.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that was a pretty good explanation of the way John reacted around other guys. He had a mindset that was fixed either from wrestling or maybe even before he started wrestling. Maybe that was just his personality. But, when people were really ticked off at, the way he acted, the insistence on the takeover, I'm number one, that makes a lot of sense from a wrestling perspective.
Of course, the biggest thrill for me in talking to Bruce was Ed Atterberry himself. This was the first time I'd talked to someone who knew him pre-shootdown. Bruce tells me about Ed Atterberry in the following abridged passage, starting with Ed's ascension to the cockpit through a now-gone Aviation Cadet Program, or AVCAD. As I touched on in my book, unlike most American pilots, AVCADs didn't have bachelor's degrees, a detail that put them at a disadvantage with their peers competing for promotions.
Ed came across, you said, as a mystery. He was, like I say, he had a good recce background. He was old-time recce. He knew all the precise ways to do things. So he was also an AVCAD. In other words, he didn't have a college degree.
Right.
Some of the best guys I flew with were AVCADs. They had maybe 2 years of college or something like that. They got out and they said that they'd rather go fly airplanes. So the fact that these guys were passed over was not so much a reflection of what kind of pilots they were, how much they knew about the job, and all like that. The big thing then is square filling. I'm sure you were Air Force. You got to fill the squares to advance, and they did. And the major big square was a degree, and these guys didn't have a degree. It comes time to choose who's going to get promoted to the next rank. First they consider people below the zone. Those are the fast burners, academy types, first in the class, all this, doing a real good job for some general or something like that. They might get below the zone, as much as 2 years below the zone, ahead of everybody else on the promotions. Yep. And then it works its way down and then you get the guys with the AVCADs. They're doing a good job and all, but they've done what they were told to do and all. It just doesn't mean that they were any worse, they were any dumber or anything like that. But they got passed over. A lot of them got passed over a second time. If you got passed over a second time, the writing was on the wall.
Meaning, AVCAD pilots like Atterberry were frequently passed over for deserving promotions, effectively ending their careers. I had speculated that part of Ed's motivation to attempt an escape was to prove himself to the system that had passed him over. In the following passage, Bruce recalls hanging out with Ed in Vietnam and painted a portrait of a friendly, thoughtful man. He also shares their daily routine as recce pilots, alone, unarmed, and unafraid.
Now, Ed, I hung out with Ed. I knew of him from Shaw. I got to know him as soon as we got, when we got to the Philippines and, flying from Travis to over the Philippines and then into Saigon. I got to know him. So when I got to Saigon, they told us, well, okay, don't leave the base. You haven't been briefed. It's dangerous out there at night and all like that. Well, Ed and I both headed out. Bullshit. So we went out in the town and didn't get in much trouble or anything like that. All we saw was a bunch of drunk GIs and some back streets and stuff. But he wasn't shrinking violet. And my other social experience with him was up at when we got up to Udon and we were sitting in the bar talking to this Thai girl who was like the mama son, the head. She spoke very good English, and so she kind of ran all the girls that were waitresses and worked at the bar and stuff like that. And she invited us to go to her place, and we did, and a bit of a bus ride and a long walk, and people making snide comments to her and all like that. But it was all above board. And we met her parents and had a nice meal and came back, and Ed was commenting about, wishes that's the way more people, we could establish relationships with the locals, because so often it was, you see a American pilot or non-com or something like that walking along with a Thai girl, and you figure he's out to get laid. And in many cases that was true, but it wasn't always true. There was room for other kind of. And so, I did that with Ed, and we'd go to the bar and we'd compare notes after a mission, and everybody would know. Okay, 5:00 in the afternoon, you'd go, you'd leave your trailer or the pool or wherever you happen to be, and you'd go into the club, which was the meeting room. And in the entrance, there'd be at 5:00 they would post a big sheet of paper, and down the left side were all the names of the pilots, and then the columns, off to the right were the times, starting at whatever it was, maybe whatever the earliest takeoff was, maybe 0400 or something like that, and it would go through the day. And then so you'd follow your name across the thing, and it was blank. That meant you weren't going to work the next day. But if there was a check mark at it, then okay, you see the time. You'd be there an hour before that, get everything ready. It was a check mark. If there'd be a B in there, that meant you're going in the barrel. If there was a B and a T, it meant you're going in the barrel, Tech 6, and you're going to the tanker, which meant that you were going to spend a lot of time in afterburner, which meant probably a pretty high priority mission of going deep into the barrel, and you're going to get shot at, and you're going to need to hit a tanker on the way home so that you can make it back. Or it could possibly mean you're going to hit a tanker because the priority on the mission was high enough that you weren't going to go back to Udon. You were going to fly the film directly down to Tom Sanu, down the headquarters, 7th Air Force headquarters. Now, if it's on BTE, that was the one that got you. And that's you're going in the barrel, you're going to hit a tanker, and you're going to have a fighter escort. And that would be Robert Olds and those guys, from UMON. And that meant you had to go in even earlier so you could get on the scrambler and talk to the guys and do your briefing about, where they were going to intercept you, where they were going to be. And they'd be out trolling for MiG. They would be out there praying that you got bounced so they could come in and get a shot at the MiG. But that's just, so all those, then you'd have the night to think about it. So that was your daily routine. And like I say, you fly 25, more often than not, you'd see at least a check mark by your name when you went in, and you'd have a few drinks and a meal and go to bed. So And then Ed and I, since we got there about the same time, we're usually pretty close. So when we briefed, we didn't fly together because we were both, usually flying with new guys, FNGs, we call them, the guys from the FTDs. And so he'd fly with somebody, but we'd be, quite often briefing near the same time. So I'd come out of intel, he'd go in, or vice versa. And, just, he never came across the way his cellmates described him, as kind of a string. Now, he wasn't the kind of guy that said, let's do this. If somebody had said, let's do this, he'd say, yeah, let's go. Let's have but he wasn't the guy to instigate things. He wasn't a troublemaker. He wasn't the guy who's going to get you in trouble or anything like that, But he was, he was competent. He was good at what he did, fixing his ways. I talked to Fred about, Ed went down. He was actually I think he only flew one, but when the Cuban Missile Crisis started and we sent the 363rd sent the F-101s down there to get pictures, and the Navy sent some of their Crusaders down. And he, I think, flew one. Ed was one of the very first to go in and take pictures of the missile sites in Cuba. But then I think he only got one because Fred, my roommate, flew a number of them down there, and he said Ed was one of the first ones down, but then he left, and then the other guys flew, multiple sorties against them. And I don't think he ever got shot at, but they were ready to get shot at. They were going low. So the only guy who got shot at was this guy in the U-2 named Anderson who got shot down. But Cuba was an exciting time for the guys in Recce. It was just before I got into Recce, so I didn't get in on that. But I know Ed was involved in that. Yeah. He'd been around Recce for some time, mostly 101s, which was a single-seat airplane. And then when we got to the 4, of course, you had to give a guy in the back. And, I never heard anybody say a negative thing about him.
Bruce also knocked down one of my pet theories, that Atterberry was hiding his recon background from the North Vietnamese because he would be an intelligence asset to them.
You made a bit of an issue about the fact that the reconnaissance pilots might have additional information, and I would say no. I would say I don't think that we were exposed. I mean, we all had top secret clearances because of the stuff that you were, but it was basically to protect what you did when you were flying and all like that. They weren't giving us a lot of knowledge because we were ops guys, we weren't planners. Yeah. So they weren't giving us any stuff that I think would have benefited the enemy any more than the regular fighter pilots. I think that might have been, a little bit exaggerated, not by you, but, just you might think it when you see guys in reconnaissance and, it's all about intel gathering and stuff like that. You might think that they have a wealth of information that would be useful to the enemy. And by and large, you can kind of tell them, they would probably know what you were doing that day. They'd want to ask you exactly what your target was and all like that. But if they got much deeper than that, you didn't have much you could tell them. You wouldn't tell them anyway. But if you, that side of it, I wouldn't emphasize the ability of a Recce pilot to be a more valuable prisoner than anybody else.
As word of my book spread in the Recce community, Bruce heard from another friend with a factual correction that embarrassed me. It seems I and my editor didn't fact-check some basic geography.
This guy, Frank Doyle, when he wrote me, he read the book, he read your book, and then he said he found 2 corrections in it. And one of them was where you had mentioned, I think, an F-105 being shot down 300 miles north of Hanoi or something like that. And he said, that can't be because the Chinese border was only 115 miles north of Hanoi. So that was, a correction he made.
Thanks very much for watching this. And thanks to Bruce Edwards for reaching out to me and sharing some stories about a man I'd written about. If you'd like to know more about Ed Atterberry or the Party Dolls itself, search for the Party Dolls online or visit my website at georgehaywardauthor.com. Thanks a lot.